Welcome to another wonderful Susanna Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susanna Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Ava's Memories. Chapter 1. It was the 1st of September when Ava Evans knew that it was time to give in. Her brother had been pleading with her for months, pleading, and outright ordering her to bend to his will and allow herself to be matched with a bachelor. Somewhere, anywhere but here in New York, where her life was passing her by with little more than the soft sound of footfalls on the street outside the sitting room window. She knew why he was so adamant. It had been 6 years, after all. 6 years since Nathan Barrow had kissed her goodbye and disappeared into nothingness. She had been young then, or, at least, she had felt young. Nathan had made her feel that way. Ava's life was marked by tragedy and disaster. By the time she was 10, she had lost her mother in an accident, and by the time she was 13, she had lost both her father and eldest brother in one devastating blow, when both succumbed to a horrible illness. At 24, she was the sort to keep to herself, rarely going out. Her last remaining family member, her brother Ben, only 4 years older than she was herself, had done his best to raise her in as happy a home as he could manage. But too many years of worrying over what tragedy might happen next left the otherwise bright, young woman a cautious soul who seemed much older than her 24 years. Trembling at shadows, Nathan had told her once, laughing. He had always had a gift for making her smile. And when he, too, had left her behind, to make his fortune in the West, she had told herself again and again that her fears were unfounded, that this last, cruel blow would be too much to ask of her. She could not lose the man she loved, after everything else that had been taken away from her. Avellini. Her brother's stern tone brought her back to herself, and Ava pushed herself out of her memories. She spent too much time there, she knew. Ben had told her as much, more than once. Just about once a day, in fact, over the last 6 years. His use of her full name, rather than the affectionate diminutive that their parents had always employed, was enough to make her sit up straight, squaring her shoulders. Yes, she said. Ben opened his mouth, then closed it again. He shot a swift glance sideways to his wife, Beryl, who answered it with a worried crinkle of her brows and leaned forward. Are you certain? Ava nodded. Yes, she said again. If the decision were not quite so weighty, she could almost have laughed at the dumbfounded expression on her older brother's face. Like Ava herself, Ben Evans had inherited their mother's serious, oval, rather pale face and large dark eyes, with a tendency to look as though something concerning was going on at every moment. The siblings also shared their dark hair, Ava's curled energetically, resisting her efforts to constrain it, while Ben kept his shorn shorter than was the custom of the day to try and keep it somewhat dignified. At the moment, he did not look very dignified at all. She couldn't blame him for that. After all, she had turned down every suggested match for the past 8 months. He reached for the letter from the matrimonial agency. Who is the match with? What's his name? Where does he live? What is his employment? She held it away from him, almost teasingly. You've pushed me to accept 10 men in the past year, she said, and suddenly you're worried about who this one in particular might be, simply because I've said yes? Ava. Ben stopped trying to snatch the paper from her grasp and faced her seriously. I hope you don't mistake me. I care about you a great deal. You're almost more of a daughter to me than a sister, despite the few years between us. Indeed, it's that great and powerful care for you that has caused me to encourage you to accept a match. You're 30 years old, Ava. She turned her eyes away. I know it, you needn't remind me. Every girl your age is married with children, he went on regardless. Why, Beryl and I have been married for 10 years now. And she's only a year your elder. Circumstances. Hang the circumstances, Ben interjected, his brow furrowing. I've thought about them, and heard about them, enough in the past 6 years. No one is denying you your right to mourn the loss of Nathan Barrow, Ava, but there comes a time when it is no longer, dignified to be so caught up in a man who may not have loved you to begin with. The old excuse, she'd heard it 100 times from her brother, and it never ceased to wound her all the same. She blinked back tears, and Beryl reached out to take her hand, nodding to her husband for a moment of silence. "No one knows what happened to Mr. Barrow," she said softly. "And we may well never find out. Would you really spend the rest of your natural-born days waiting here, a spinster, with no household of your own, while your entire life passes you by without a cause for joy, for love?" She squeezed Ava's hand affectionately. "No love is worth breaking your heart over for good," she said. "At least with this match, Ava, you'll have a chance to start anew." Years ago, 6 years, to be precise, Ava had dreamed of starting anew right here in New York City. With the man she loved by her side, surely things would be different. She had dreamed of casting off the tragedy that she had worn so long like a cloak, and embracing the life before her with all the dazzling energy of a girl in the first blush of her first romance. She pushed that thought away, too. It would do her no good now. She had already made her choice. "What do you want me to say?" she asked Beryl quietly. "I've said that I will accept this one. I can give you no more than that, my willingness." She glanced up at Ben, who had the grace to look a bit shamefaced over his harsh words. The thought struck her that she would soon leave him, her only family member, behind, and for good, too, for she knew that once she left New York, she would never return. No, one way or another, what she found in Texas would keep her there forever. "His name is Jonathan Rogers," she said, handing over the agency's letter. "He is 38, and never married. They don't say why. Perhaps he had a broken heart, once, too." Ben's dark eyes flashed at her for a moment, narrowed and searching, but he took her comment in the rather bitter humor she had intended. They knew each other too well for him to mistake her too seriously. That was one good thing about the Evans blood, she thought, despite everything that seemed to happen to them, despite their strange, almost accursed lives, they kept their chins up with a measure of humor, wry and bitter though it might be. She suspected that she would need it, wherever she ended up. "Texas," said Ben, reading through the letter swiftly. "A cattle baron, wealthy, if I know anything about cattle in Texas. Why, all of New York gets their meat from there." "That ought to please you," Ava said. "You can be certain that you won't have to support me, once I'm married." "Ought to please you even more," Ben said, not looking up. "Your husband can afford to indulge you in any whim you imagine." Now, children," said Beryl with a sigh. "Let's remember to be kind to each other. After all, if this match is made, Ava will be leaving us soon, and who knows when she might return." Never, Ava thought, but she did not say the word. Her affectionate, sensitive sister-in-law already looked rather upset over the whole thing. It had been Ben, more than anyone, who'd pushed for Ava to marry, if not there in New York, to one of his acquaintances, then elsewhere, through the services of a matrimonial agency. Beryl was sweet and generous, and she would undoubtedly have allowed Ava to remain there as a spinster under her roof to the end of her days. Ava would have made an excellent nanny for the children that they still hoped someday to have. 10 years of marriage, and no hint of expecting. If Ava did not marry herself, would the Evans line die out once and for all? Could that be where the lives of tragedy that she and her brother had led would end up? It was difficult to think of. No, that couldn't be so. Someday, Beryl and Ben would have a family of their own, healthy and happy, with nary a tragedy in the mix. And she, Ava, well, the future was uncertain. She wasn't even yet convinced that there was one awaiting her in Texas at all. Ben looked up from the letter, his brow furrowed once more. "Seymour, Texas," he said. "Archer County. Why does that sound familiar?" Ava lifted her chin, without answering. Her heart was beating rather quickly, and she felt as though she ought to be holding her breath, but if she gave any such sign, surely her brother would realize her intentions. As he might well do anyhow. He narrowed his eyes at her thoughtfully, but there was no threat in that gaze, mere speculation. It was Beryl who remembered. Ava spotted the moment at which the recollection became clear to her, for her sister-in-law sat up straight and opened her mouth as though to exclaim, and then quickly covered her mouth with her hand. Ben glanced at her, his frown deepening. That aborted reaction was all it took for him to remember. Archer County, he said. That's where Nathan was headed off to, wasn't it? To seek his fortune in that gold rush, even though everyone told him it was long over. Ava clenched her hands in her lap. Yes, she said, knowing there was no point in denying her knowledge. That's where he was going. Whether he ever arrived, well, we simply don't know, do we, Ben? And perhaps we never will. He frowned again to hear his own words parroted back to him, but she had done her best to keep her tone mild, stripped of all bitterness. After a moment, the tightness of his mouth relaxed. That's right, he said. It would be foolish to look for him, you do know that, don't you, Ava? A fool's errand, indeed. I know it, Ben. Especially, he went on, his voice softening as he looked at his younger sister, when there's a good man like a glance at the letter to remind himself. Like Jonathan Rogers who wants to marry you and care for you as he ought. Ava took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, Ben, she said. It's Mr. Rogers that I intend to marry in Seymour. I suppose it seemed fitting, somehow, that I should marry there. Poetic. Beryl's sympathetic face warmed with a smile, and Ben relaxed a little further. But there was still, thought his sister with a keen gaze, a note of hesitation, and of suspicion. This time, she did hold her breath. All right, he said at last. If you're certain. After all, you are 30 years old, Ava. I suppose you're old enough to know your own mind. And at the very least it will get you out of the house, and out of your own head, and away from all thoughts of Nathan Barrow. As she clasped his hand and accepted a congratulatory embrace from Beryl, Ava prayed that her real feelings were invisible to both. It was true that she was leaving behind New York, the city of her childhood and the place where she had once dreamed of a future with the man she loved. But she was not moving away from her thoughts of Nathan Barrow. When she boarded a train headed southwest to Seymour, Texas, she would be running headlong into her past. Chapter 2. The last warm glow of summer had long since died away, replaced by the growing chill of autumn, when Ava Evans stepped down from the train at Seymour's lone platform. She was the solitary passenger to disembark here, a quarter-mile from town. For a moment, she wavered. The relative peace and safety of the train held more appeal than it had at any previous point along these last 2.5 weeks, even considering that peace and safety came at the price of discomfort and noise. But the porter had put her trunk down on the platform with a solid thunk, a sound of finality, and she hadn't the courage to even think of asking him to heft it back into the train car once more. No, she was here in Seymour, Texas, and that was where she would stay. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing Nathan standing right here where she stood now, looking out over the stretch of rolling plain that led into the outskirts of the town. The thought gave her the courage she needed, not to return to the train, but to take firm hold of her valise and step down from the platform. Behind her, the train sent out a long, lonely whistle and began to churn away. For all the solitary nature of the platform, the scope of its original building hinted at a past that was far more populated than the present. Paths led away from the platform in all directions, many of them were overgrown with grass, faded to gold by the long heat of summer and now waving in the brisk breeze of fall. On the other side of the train tracks stood a stand of trees, of a sort she could not readily identify. The branches were touched with brilliant colors, yellow and magenta and scarlet and gold staining the shiny dark green of each leaf. In a few weeks, she knew, October would be halfway over, and the leaves would have fallen with the oncoming cold. The seasons passed here in Texas, same as they did back home in New York. There was no one waiting for her. She gave a heavy sigh and returned to the platform to take a seat on her trunk, the only chair available to her. Perhaps the train was early. Perhaps the person who was due to collect her was late. Perhaps she had been forgotten entirely. She was too tired to care about it, one way or another. All she wanted was a cup of hot tea and a warm bath, though she would have accepted a glass of water and a seat by a fire, instead. Though the day was brilliant with sun, the blue skies arching gladly overhead, there was a note to the breeze that seemed to give it teeth. Or perhaps it wasn't so much the weather that made her feel cold, perhaps it was simply the circumstances. Either way, She drew her light cloak a little closer around her shoulders and made up her mind to wait as patiently as she could. Her intentions were put to the test over the next half hour, and by the time a cart rattled down the path from the left of town, she was feeling downright irritable. She stood as it pulled to a halt, resisting the urge to fold her arms impatiently, but only just. The man seated in the driver's box of the cart simply looked at her for a minute. She regarded him in return, taking in what details she could see from this distance. Older than her, clearly, he wore no hat, and his dark hair was clearly thinning on top. He was rather plain, she thought distantly, not that it mattered, for she wasn't here because of his looks. Nor was she here to fall in love. As the thought crossed her mind, he grinned suddenly, and she felt a strange little clutch in her heart. That smile transformed his face from mere plainness, from something merely passable, to something more. Something that she could not quite put her finger on, not exactly handsome, no, but appealing. Attractive, even. He stood and leapt athletically down from the cart with a swiftness that belied his apparent age. He moved like a much younger man, just out of boyhood. Standing, he was revealed to be very tall and thin, though there was grace to his movements that suggested a hidden strength. He took the steps to the platform in a single bound and was beside her before she could blink. "Miss Evans? I'm awful sorry I'm late. This your trunk? I'll take it for you, don't you lift a finger." He dropped her valise on top of the trunk and hefted it as easily as though it weighed hardly more than a feather. "Come along with me, if you please, and we'll get you out to the ranch." "I had supposed that I would be staying in a boarding house or an inn," she said, hearing the stiffness in her voice but feeling unable to bend. His movements were so sudden, his presence so overwhelming, that she felt entirely at a loss, retreating into coolness. "Until we were married, I mean. Of course, that is presuming that you are Mr. Jonathan Rogers." He stopped suddenly and tossed a glance over his shoulder, eyes narrowed, and then laughed just as suddenly. "Right you are," he said. "Forgive me, Miss Evans, I'm rude as a skunk, aren't I?" "You're right, I'm Jonathan Rogers. You can call me Jonathan, or Johnny, if you want. Most folks call me one or the other, when they're not calling at me something much worse." Another easy chuckle, and she took a step forward unconsciously. Despite the delay of his arrival and the subsequent abruptness with which he moved and spoke, she felt rather drawn to him, and that was enough to make her feel a panic growing deep within. No, 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 her broken heart rebelled against the very suggestion of attraction, with no regard for the question of her presumptive engagement. If she succeeded in finding what happened to Nathan, if she succeeded in finding Nathan himself, then the matrimonial agency would simply have to be paid the fee that would inevitably result from breaking the engagement without due cause. A prior romance, she was certain, would not be considered due cause. But she would cross that bridge when she came to it, when she found out what happened to Nathan. "Is there no boarding house available?" "Oh, there won't be any fuss about you staying out at the ranch with us. There's plenty of folks on the spread, and near a half-dozen in the big house. My brother's there with me, and our cousin Kathy. Poor kid, she lost both her parents years ago and came to live with us, as there's not many of our family left around here. Most of my folks are back east. It was my pa who was the stubborn one, insisted on coming to Texas back when it belonged to Mexico, when he was a young buck. Bought up all the land he could get his hands on. Well, it paid off for him, and for me and Jacob, I reckon, but most of the rest of the family hasn't got much to say to us, these days." He shook his head with a rueful smile. "Guess they think we're sort of uncouth." His eyes were keen, and now that she was seated beside him in the driver's box, she saw that they were an unusual shade of green, almost the color of spring leaves. There was a brightness to them that seemed to lend energy to the rest of his face. Though plain when he was dour, he was captivating when he smiled, and his eyes lit up. "Don't reckon you know too many uncouth folks yourself, Miss Evans, seein' as you're from New York. They don't breed 'em like that out there, do they?" She frowned slightly. "I suspect there's just as many uncouth people in New York City as there are anywhere else in the world," she said, and wondered what it was about the way he spoke that made her feel like defending her home city's right to be uncouth. There was just something about him. It unsettled her, put her on the edge, and made her lean toward him without quite intending to. "Well, I don't know much about the East," said Jonathan Rogers pleasantly, "but I reckon you're right. Maybe more uncouth in New York than even here in Seymour. You'll have to let me know when the verdict is in." He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved into a gentle trot, taking them back along the path to the east of town. She glanced over her shoulder to see the train platform shrinking away behind them, and turned back, swallowing hard. Well, she'd made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it, come what may. They rode along in silence for a time. It was not entirely uncomfortable. He didn't seem to be bothered by her quiet, taking it for granted that she was tired out from her trip. And she was, that much was true. It was almost a relief not to feel forced into being personable and friendly, or even giving cold rejoinders and reserved answers to questions that he might have asked. Without prodding, she felt free to simply look around her as countryside rolled by. It was remarkably flat, and dry, too, the golden warmth of summer not yet yielding to the cold rains of the later fall. No, the few stands of trees that they passed were lit with brilliant colors, and leaves bowled across the path in the chilly breeze, while off to her right side the sun was slowly sinking toward the horizon. The sky was the most brilliant blue she'd ever seen. It seemed depthless, endless, arching overhead as though to take in the whole of the world. So, this was Texas. This was the place where Nathan Barrow had gone to seek his fortune. The question that rose to her tongue, had he seen Nathan, or heard of someone of that name, any time in the last 6 years? She fought back before it was spoken. She had to be cautious, she sensed. The man beside her believed that she was there to marry him, and, indeed, she had agreed to do so. If she wanted to find out what had happened to Nathan, or if he had ever made his way to Archer County at all, she would have to be discreet. "Not long now," Jonathan Rogers said. "The ranch isn't too far from the train tracks. My pa planned it that way, figuring that it would make it all the easier to load cattle onto the cars and transport 'em east and west. Of course, 6 or 7 times a year the hands drive a passel of 'em out themselves, but the rest of the time we can load up a dozen or so stock cars and that works just fine." He glanced sideways at her and gave a slightly embarrassed chuckle. "Though I reckon that doesn't interest you much." "It never interested me until I was older and started to take a hand in runnin' the ranch. Knowin' where your next meal is coming from has a way of concentrating the mind." "I suppose that's understandable. Now, you won't be expected to do anything with the ranch, of course. Jacob and I, he's my older brother, we handle it all, from birthing calves to keeping the ledgers. With a dozen ranch hands, of course. Couldn't do it all on our own." "What will I be expected to do, then?" He glanced at her swiftly, and she bit her lip, hearing the harshness in her voice. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to sound so abrupt. I'm tired, that's all. I'll be better in the morning, I expect, please don't think anything of it." "Of course you're tired, Miss Evans," he said warmly. "Anyone would be. It's been an awful long journey for you, and goodness knows, Texas is a world apart from anything you've ever seen, I reckon." "Well, in truth I don't know what to tell you. My cousin Kathy will have a better idea. She's been running the household since she moved in 10 years ago. She's a few years younger than you are, I reckon, but she treats Jacob and me like we were her sons. Once we're married, the house'll be yours, of course." He paused, hesitating, though she could not be sure why. "If you wouldn't mind sharing with Kathy as much as you can, I'd be grateful." "Of course," she said, frowning slightly. "It's her home, isn't it? I would never think of turning anyone away." His face relaxed a little. "Thank you, Miss Evans. It's just, well, Kathy's all for me gettin' married. She practically wrote the letter to the agency herself. But I know it's on her mind. She ought to be gettin' married herself, a girl her age, 27, I think she is. But she hasn't settled yet." Ava shifted uncomfortably. After all, 27 was a few years younger than she was herself, and she was far from settled, marriage contract or no. But his tone was mild, not accusatory or even teasing, and she forced herself to respond in kind. "Perhaps there simply aren't enough men in a town the size of Seymour to choose from." He glanced toward her, one thick black eyebrow raised. Is that so? Reckon that's not a problem for girls in New York, eh? Now his tone was teasing, and she understood why. She came from a place much bigger than Seymour, and yet here she was, finding a husband thousands of miles away from where she belonged. She put her hands in her lap, primly, and decided to ignore this comment entirely. How big of a town is Seymour? Oh, there's plenty of bachelors, if that's what you're thinking. Matter of fact, Kathy's one of the few unmarried women in the whole of Archer County. We're a land of grumpy old men, Miss Evans, set in our ways, with little use for women except as cooks, until one of 'em chooses to look our way, that is. He chuckled. I'm as guilty of that as anyone else. I'd have married years ago if I'd found someone to tolerate my ugly face. I don't think you're ugly, Mr. Rogers. No? The glance he gave her was surprised, and she in turn was surprised to see a hint of red come into his deeply suntanned cheeks. He seemed to be surprised at himself, too, and his reaction, pushing on without pursuing it. Well, Kathy ought to have her choice, by rights. Maybe I'm biased because we're family, but I think she's just about the prettiest girl in the whole of the county, and she's sweet and kind, too. Deserves a good man, and I'll see that she gets one, when she decides which one she wants. Here we are, Bar One Ranch. Welcome home, Miss Evans. The ranch house was enormous and sprawling, 2 stories high and obviously well cared for. The thought of being the mistress of the house, responsible for keeping it tidy and presentable, was immediately intimidating. Ava had only ever lived in the households of others, first her father and then her brother, and had never had the final say, nor the final responsibility, for its upkeep. She swallowed her momentary fear, determined to focus instead on the prettiness of the spread as it was. After all, if Jonathan Rogers' cousin was caring for it now, then there was no reason why she should not continue. Ava had no real intention of ever being the mistress of Bar One Ranch. Still, she could appreciate it while she was there. Jonathan handed her down from the cart, and the door was flung open, revealing a pink-cheeked and rosy young woman who bustled down, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling widely. Why, this must be Miss Evans. Welcome, welcome, my dear. Was your journey exhausting? I'm sure it must have been. Come inside and have a glass of lemonade, or would you prefer tea or coffee? Or perhaps a little whiskey against the cold. That'll set you up. Jonathan Rogers sent Ava on her way with his cousin, laughing. Mind you set out some of that whiskey for me, Kathy. Oh, what have you done to deserve it? Kathy laughed at him, her eyes flashing merrily, as she took Ava under her wing and led her into the house. It was just as neat and well appointed inside as it was outside. Ava had never seen anything quite like it. But then, she'd never visited the home of a Texas cattle baron. Before she knew it, she was ensconced in an enormous, comfortable kitchen before a roaring fire, with a cup of tea in her hand and a small glass of whiskey waiting beside her. Kathy went about her business, chatting all the while, stirring the pot on the stove and explaining details about the running of the ranch that Ava simply could not comprehend in her current state. Between the warmth and the little sips of whiskey, her tiredness gradually overcame her, and she found herself sinking into a stupor, her eyes drifting closed against her will. When she awoke, the kitchen was silent and empty, though the fire was still blazing merrily. The light outside had died down and a long autumn twilight was upon them. For a moment she stayed where she was, reveling in the sensation of being still and alone. Though it was a strange place, it was comfortable and friendly. She could see herself being at home here. Gradually the sound of voices filtered through to her, drifting down the hall. Without thinking, she pulled herself to her feet and began to follow the sound. One of the voices belonged to Jonathan, the other to another man whom she did not know. It was Jonathan who spoke first. And I reckon she'll be just fine after she sleeps a while. Poor thing looked exhausted when I collected her at the station. And the drive here, bumpy as it is, likely didn't help much. Might she have been less exhausted if you'd been waiting for her at the station itself? Queried the other voice. It was soft and mild, with an underlying breathiness that she did not quite understand. It sounded as though the voice's owner had been running and had only just taken his seat, but that simply wasn't possible, was it? Whatever the case, Jonathan's next words distracted her from the unknown speaker. "I know you think I'm awful foolish," he said, ruefully. "Truth is, I drove around and around town for an hour after I left here to collect her. Just couldn't make up my mind to do it. Johnny, we talked about this, you agreed that it was the right thing to do, gettin' married. I know I did. But a fellow has a right to change his mind, doesn't he? Not about something like this, Johnny, not when the poor girl has come all this way." The voice paused, and when it resumed it was even softer. She had to edge forward closer to the door of the sitting room to hear it clearly. "We all know that you ought to be married. Soon, you'll be alone, and that ain't right. Not for a man like you, Johnny." "It won't be so soon, Jacob." She was surprised to hear a sharp edge to his voice. "Not so soon as all that. I'll chase that rascal away next time he shows his face here. I reckon it's inevitable, Johnny. No matter what you do, you can't stave off fate." "Well, I can try." His voice was grim. A moment of silence passed between the two, and she chewed on her fingertip, hesitating as to whether she should barge in, pretending not to have heard a thing, or disappear back into the kitchen, and pretend the same thing. At last, the second voice went on. "Why is it that you're having second thoughts, Johnny? After all this time, too. The agency pretty much guaranteed you a good match. The agency doesn't know what it's getting into. I reckon they're the experts." "Not about this," Jonathan Rogers said firmly. "Not when it comes to me. And I'm still not too sure about it even now. If she hadn't been so pretty, I might still be driving around Seymour." This, for Ava, was enough. A hot burst of anger leapt into her heart, and she turned away swiftly before it escaped her and made itself heard to the two men. So, he believed the matrimonial agency that had matched them didn't know its business. He thought that it had made a mistake, clearly, and if she hadn't been pretty enough, he would have left her there on the platform by her lonesome and gone about his merry way. The urge to demand an explanation for his behavior, for his words, was strong, but she managed to conquer it, fleeing back to the kitchen, where she returned to the rocking chair in stony silence and sat staring at the flames. All the attraction she had felt for Jonathan Rogers seemed to melt away with his hard words. The fact that she had, indeed, come here to look for the man she'd loved, rather than marry the man she was engaged to, didn't matter in the face of what she'd heard him say. Perhaps it was all to the good. Neither one of them wanted to be married, at least, not to each other. As far as she was concerned, their engagement was as good as ended right that very moment. Chapter 3. Somehow, despite her anger, the warmth of the fire and the quiet kitchen managed to lull her into something near to a doze, so when Kathy returned to the kitchen, she started up from her chair. The younger woman chuckled warmly and pressed her back down. Now, everything's just fine, don't you worry a bit. You slept right through supper, but I've got a plate for you here. Look, Johnny and Jacob are coming to keep you company while you eat." The last thing Ava wanted was company while she ate, at least this company. She was certain that she would lose her appetite at once. But she found that the plateful of warm stew set before her was hot and aromatic, making her mouth water. She hadn't had a real, hot meal in quite some time, after all. The food on the train certainly did not qualify. She simply kept her head down and tried not to look across the table at Jonathan Rogers. "I reckon you must be exhausted," he said frankly, not seeming to register that she was avoiding his gaze. "Even that little catnap likely wasn't enough. It's still early yet in the evening, but we'll let you get some sleep after you eat, and not bother you in the morning, till you're ready to come down. The spare room's all set up," put in Kathy, handing him a cup of coffee. He gave her a grin of thanks. "You didn't meet Jacob yet, did you, Miss Evans? This is my older brother." With only a glance at him, she could see why the elder Rogers' voice was so breathy and gentle. Jacob Rogers was clearly ill, very ill, if she was any judge. The paleness of his skin, the way his eyes were sunken into his head, reminded her uncomfortably of the way her father had looked before he died. But Jacob Rogers smiled brightly enough, and there was genuine warmth there. He was as plain as his brother, though without the liveliness in his eyes, The green was the color of old pines rather than fresh young leaves. She knew that the likelihood was that he was no more than a few years older than Jonathan himself, but he appeared almost to be old enough to be his father. Though the reminder of her own father's illness was painful, there was enough warmth and friendliness in Jacob Rogers' face that she found herself responding in kind, reaching across the table to shake his hand. She caught a glimpse of Jonathan's expression at the contact, and it puzzled her. He looked proud, almost, though of her or of his brother, she was not sure. Perhaps she had imagined it. She certainly was tired enough that her mind might be running away with her. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Evans," said Jacob Rogers. "Call me Jake, won't you? You remind me awfully of our little sister, Mary. She's passed away now, some years back, but she had a sweet smile like yours. She always called me Jake." "All right," she agreed, with a nod. It struck her suddenly that the Rogers family might have had as many tragedies in their past as her own clan, and the thought tugged at her heart, despite her exhausted anger with Jonathan and his overheard comments. She found herself smiling all the more genuinely at the elder brother for his words. "I'm mighty glad you've come to stay with us," Jacob went on, with a glance at his younger brother. "That's what we've been missin', Johnny," a fresh smile. "Well, I beg your pardon," said Kathy archly, but she squeezed her cousin's shoulder briefly to let him know that she was only teasing. "A little newness around the place won't hurt," allowed Jonathan. He caught her eye, though she tried to avoid it, and half smiled. "But it can wait until tomorrow. I'll take you around the ranch in the morning, Miss Evans, straight after breakfast. Let you get the feel for it, and we'll all be anxious to know what you think." Ava turned her head away, setting her fork down on the plate. She wasn't at all certain what she would think about the Bar One Ranch, and now, confused though her feelings were, she wasn't the least bit certain what she thought of the man she was intended to marry either. Perhaps a good night's rest would restore her certainty. That was her only real hope. Despite her misgivings and the unsettled nature of her mind, she slept more soundly than she had expected. The exhaustion of the trip, no doubt, played a part, and though she longed to dream of Nathan Barrow, it was instead the two Rogers men and their rosy-cheeked young cousin who haunted her dreams, seated silently at the kitchen table, passing bowl after bowl of uneaten food. She awoke with a feeling of goodwill that was almost immediately put to the test by the sound of the rooster crowing quite loudly just outside her window. The clock on the wall revealed it to be just gone 7 o'clock in the morning. The daylight was coming later already, with the onset of autumn. She got out of bed, despite the longing to simply wallow in her blankets for another hour or two, and took a deep breath. The window was open, letting in fresh, cool air, and the vault of the sky was the pale blue of a cold morning. Kathy was in the kitchen and called out a cheerful hello as Ava entered. "You're awake earlier than I expected. Did you sleep well? Have some coffee, you'll feel better. I reckon it'll take a few days for you to really feel at home here, but please, make yourself as comfortable as you can. The boys are out in the barn already, of course. Johnny starts the chores around 5, and Jacob isn't usually too far behind him, though at times," she hesitated suddenly, biting her lip. "Well, I guess it depends on the day." "Thank you," Ava murmured, accepting the mug of hot, steaming coffee that was pressed on her, and taking a seat at the kitchen table. "Might I help you with anything?" "Oh, no, you just relax yourself. I'll get breakfast done in a jiffy." Ava sipped her coffee, wondering how long it would be before the brothers returned from their chores, and whether it might be an opportune time to begin to press for information. If she really wanted to find out what happened to Nathan, she would undoubtedly have to ask around town. Perhaps she might have to ask everyone before she was able to find the information she sought. But the Rogers had evidently been in the area for quite some time, and were surely well known, as some of the wealthiest in Archer County. Bar One was reputedly the largest stock ranch in the county, according to the matrimonial agency, and one of the largest in the state of Texas itself. Yes, they likely would be able to hear much of the talk and gossip that tended to travel around such towns, but would rich folks like them know anything about a poor man from New York, here in Texas to seek his fortune? There was nothing to do but try. "You've been here for 10 years, Mr. Rogers said." She kept her voice casual. "How do you find Seymour, as a hometown?" "Oh, it's a wonderful place. You won't be sorry that you came here." "I'm certainly not." The younger woman smiled, but there was a sadness to it that seemed to belie her words. It made Ava wonder. My cousins have been very good to me, especially considering I'm the poor relation. They hadn't any real obligation to take me on, as old as I was when Pa died. You were 17? 18? 17, and only just. But that's plenty old enough for a girl to get married, especially here in Archer County, where the women are few and far between. She shrugged one shoulder. I'm glad I came to stay with Johnny and Jacob, though. Much preferable to marrying the first man who asked me, and that's what I would have done had I stayed in Barkerville, 20 miles away. That's where I grew up, Barkerville. My pa was a schoolteacher there, and we were poor as church mice. The boy's father, my uncle, always said that Pa ought to come and stay with them on the ranch, as there was plenty of work to be had, but he liked his books, did Pa. And he was a good teacher. I'm sure he was. I often thought that I might go to college and become a teacher, too, like Pa, but the Lord had other plans for me, I guess. She laughed lightly. I like to care for the household here, it helps me to feel that I'm needed somewhere. Her eyes found Ava's, and this time there was no sorrow in them, but genuine goodwill. Of course, it's to be your household, now. I hope you won't think that I'll simply shut you out, Ava said swiftly. I haven't the faintest idea how to run a household, and I'm hoping that you'll help me. Why, it's easy as pie when it's Johnny and Jacob's home. They're sweet, and they never kick up a fuss. Still, I'll need you, I'm sure. Ah, that's sweet of you. Her dimpled cheeks turned pink. I'm glad to help. Makes a girl happy to have a home. Of course, if you find that you're ready to run a household of your own, and get married, Ava amended, I wouldn't stand in your way. Oh. She turned away again, but Ava saw her cheeks grow darker. I don't reckon that you'll have to worry about that. There was almost certainly something that the girl wasn't telling her, Ava thought, but it didn't feel quite right to press her for the information, here and now, when they had only just met, and when the men might walk in at any moment. Instead, she settled for asking questions about Seymour itself, doing her best to lead it naturally around to the gold rush that had happened some decade and a half before. As a source of information, Kathy was rather disappointing. Most of her life in the 10 years since she had come to Seymour had occurred right there on the ranch. I rarely venture into town these days, even, she admitted. It's just pleasant enough for me right here, so I don't figure that I need to go anywhere else. What about events in town? Ava pressed, at a loss for how else to proceed. Aren't there get-togethers? Dances? Barn raisings? Her knowledge of life in the West was minimal, fueled largely by the stories she had read in dime novels and women's periodicals. For the most part, she knew, she was grasping at straws. But straws, it seemed, were all she had, and besides, they could break camels' backs, couldn't they? Oh, there's gatherings now and then, I suppose, Kathy allowed. I've been to a few, over the years. Her face warmed and softened with the thought. Dances, yes, it's lovely to hear the band strike up, and a line of fellows begging for your favor, even if for only a moment. She sighed. But it's been a few years now since I was last at a dance, Ava, and I don't rightly know that they're the same as they used to be. She gave a rueful shrug. What is? Kathy was not giving her any more information than she'd already possessed, and far less than she had hoped for. Ava bit her lip, realizing suddenly that if she pressed too much further than she had already, the young woman might wonder at her intentions. Perhaps, she said, grasping at straws yet again, I might go into town myself someday soon. I'd like to write a letter to my brother and his wife, and make sure that it makes the post. The idea came suddenly, a sort of inspiration, but of course it was only natural to want to write to her brother, far away in New York. Evidently, Kathy agreed, for she brightened perceptibly. The strange, unnameable melancholy that had overcome her with Ava's questions seemed to be conquered, for the moment. Oh, yes, of course you must. Your brother must miss you terribly. I can only imagine how my cousins would feel, if I left them to venture far afield after all this time, and you've been with your brother for far longer. At least, that's what the matrimonial agency said. She blushed slightly, turning her head away, and the thought swept over Ava that perhaps the matrimonial agency knew more than she would have supposed. Perhaps Ben had informed them all about Ava's lost love. But no, surely not. He was loath to speak the name of Nathan Barrow as it was. Doubtless he was eager to simply leave the thought of the man behind, if he could, and found his younger sister's future on something far removed from the past. The idea that Kathy and her cousins might know something of the pain she had lived through gave her a strange, unnamed clutch at the heart, and she found it best to hurry on with the conversation as though the thought had not occurred to her at all. I miss him, too. And his wife, my sister-in-law, Beryl. They were very kind to me, and I'm grateful for all they did over the years. It was Ben, my brother, who decided it would be best for me to apply to a matrimonial agency. That's kind of him, isn't it? Kathy smiled. On impulse, Ava said, perhaps your cousins would do the same for you, if you asked them. Kathy's eyes flew wide, and the color in her rosy cheeks drained away. Marry someone else, someone who lives far from here, she stammered. I don't think I could even consider it. She took a deep breath, obviously trying to regain her composure, and managed a rather forced-looking smile. No, I'm not nearly as brave as you are, Miss Evans. Ava could not help but wonder what the true meaning of her reaction might be. Someone else, she had said. But that wasn't just someone far away. Someone else sounded as though there had been someone in her heart to begin with. She was forced to let the mystery go unanswered for the moment as the two Rogers men returned. The kitchen door flew open, and she saw the blustery evidence of the autumn breeze rushing by behind them, scarlet and goldenrod and peach-colored leaves bowling across the hard dirt of the yard as they entered. Outside the window, the trees that ranged around the property were bowing their heads to the wind, which had evidently picked up. The smell of apples came in with the men, and she inhaled deeply of it before she could catch herself. Jonathan Rogers spotted the movement, and a smile crossed over his face. She turned her head away. She told herself that the look of discouragement that followed in the wake of the smile must have been from some other reason than her refusal to meet his gaze. Or perhaps she had only imagined it to begin with. After all, he had no reason to feel downhearted. He had not really wanted to be engaged to her in the first place. Chapter 4. Though she was reluctant to allow herself to be shown around by Johnny Rogers, unwilling to have much time alone with him until she was more settled in her mind, she had to admit that the display put on by the Bar One Ranch property was strikingly beautiful. Most of Texas, so far as she could tell, was flat. By hard work or providence, the 1,000 or so acres of the ranch were gently rolling, lending an interest and appeal to the spread. The grasses were engoldened by the summer sun, dotted with cattle. Now, the sun was blessedly warm in contrast to the cool of the shade under the stands of spreading oaks and other trees that she was not familiar with. The leaves were a whirlwind of color, like the dancers she had once seen in a parade on the streets of New York. Scarlet and vermilion and goldenrod and a deep, unnamed purple filled the branches of the trees. When the breeze came up, it sent the gem-like fragments spinning in all directions. After the first day, when Jonathan showed her through the fields around the house, she took to going for a walk all by herself each afternoon, in the warmest part of the day. On the third day, she discovered a large, smooth-surfaced pond, with a weeping willow curled over it protectively. Above it all, the vivid blue bowl of the sky arched, pristine and proud. She might feel conflicted about the reasons that had brought her here to Texas, but she could not be sorry to find herself amid such beauty, so unlike anything she had ever known. After she had been at the ranch for a week, she had her first chance to begin her investigations. Jacob had been feeling poorly, a mite poorly, more than usual, as Kathy had put it sympathetically. The young woman agreed to drive her cousin into the doctor's office for a visit. Ava suspected that Kathy often did so, as much to offer Jacob the support of her emotional strength as to ensure that he arrived safely. Knowing that Ava herself was interested in venturing into town, Kathy invited her along. The primary reason, as far as Kathy knew, was to deliver her letter back home personally to the post office and ensure that it went into the postman's bag. This objective being accomplished, Ava was free to look around town, free to familiarize herself with Seymour, and free to discreetly inquire if anyone might remember the arrival 6 years prior of a man named Nathan Barrow. She was reluctant to pursue her questions openly. After all, what if nothing came of it? What if Nathan had never made it here at all? Then she must face the choice of ending her engagement with Jonathan Rogers outright and finding some other position, or follow through on the agreement they had made through the matrimonial agency. She knew what her brother would wish for her. She suspected that she knew what Jonathan secretly wished. As for what she herself wished, well, that remained to be seen. In her heart, she knew that there was another possibility, that Nathan had come here to seek his fortune, and had simply decided not to return, of his own volition. Whether this be because he'd made his fortune or because he hadn't, or because he got cold feet about marriage or perhaps even decided to marry someone else, she could not be certain and did not wish to speculate. But there was always the chance, she knew, that she would be forced to find out. That, in the end, had been her brother's belief. That Nathan had simply played with her heart, not meaning a word of it, and had gone on to live the rest of his life without looking back. Steeling herself, she began with the postmaster. "Excuse me, sir, do you know how long it might take for my letter to reach my brother in New York?" The postmaster was a kindly older fellow who put her in mind of Father Christmas. His smile nearly disappeared behind his beard. "Why, it'll be at least 2 weeks, young lady, if I'm any judge. But we'll get it there as soon as possible." She smiled back. "Thank you. I don't suppose you get a lot of mail to New York, do you?" No, can't say that I do, but a novelty's rare enough here in Seymour that I'm grateful for it." A grandfatherly chuckle. "Perhaps you had more mail back east during the gold rush," she suggested. "Well, you're right there, young lady. All sorts of folks came here right about that time, and most of 'em had to write letters explainin' that their fortune wasn't waitin' for 'em after all." Another chuckle, and a shake of his head. She took a deep breath. "Did you ever meet anyone from New York, who came here for the gold rush?" The postmaster stroked his beard thoughtfully. "A handful, I reckon," he said at last. "Couldn't rightly tell you whether they sent letters back, though, and anyhow, that's a few decades back now, young lady, and our mail system is much improved since then." He beamed at her proudly, and she gave him another smile and a quiet thanks as she went on her way. Undoubtedly there had been New Yorkers amongst the hopeful fortune seekers who came to Archer County during the gold rush nearly 20 years before, but it wasn't 20 years ago that she was interested in, but only 6 years in the past. The postmaster was kindly, it was true, but it was clear that he hadn't any help to give her. She meandered through the main streets of Seymour for a time, making a mental note of the boarding house she passed, as well as the 2 inns that had been hastily erected in response to the gold rush. Now, they were clearly half empty, most of the rooms dark and curtains drawn. She wondered whether Nathan had ever stayed in either of them, or in the boarding house, or whether he had managed to stake a claim of his own. Why, he might be out there somewhere even now. The thought ran through her quickly, and she shuddered in the swiftness of its wake, drawing her shawl a bit more closely around her. Would she be glad if she found him here in Seymour? Or would the sadness of knowing his lovelessness for a certainty simply be added to the long list of tragedies that had marked her life since she was a child? "Hey there, miss, are you all right?" The man who stopped her, with a hand gently laid on her arm, was somewhere around her own age, with a round, innocent face that reminded her of that of an infant. He wore a hat drawn low against the tugging of the wind. Beneath it, the hair that escaped was wispy and yellow. His clothes were a bit on the shabby side, and he put her in mind of nothing so much as a childish scarecrow. But his hand was gentle, not pressing, and his face was filled with friendly concern. She shook off the tremors and straightened up, forcing a smile. "Yes, quite all right, thank you. If you're cold, I reckon you could do worse than stepping into the general store, here, and warming by the fire for a minute. Grady won't mind, he's a friend of mine." She glanced up impulsively, spotting the weathered sign that swung above them, Grady's Mercantile, Seymour, Texas. "Oh, thank you, but I'm all right, really." "You're sure?" "It's no trouble at all." "Thank you." "I'm certain." He stood back a step and pursed his lips, looking her over thoughtfully. He looked as though he didn't believe her, but to her relief, he did not press her any further. "You're not from around here, are you, miss? I'd remember a pretty face like yours, I'm sure." I reckon I've been here long enough to get to know the locals. Have you? She said, her mind racing. How long, would you say? Oh, somewhere between 8 weeks and 8 years. He chuckled. A town this size, it doesn't take too long to get to know everyone. And everyone knows me, too, except for you, I reckon. He put out a hand for her to shake. Albert Macklin. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Macklin. My name is Avellini Evans. They shook hands, the formality of the process belied by his knowing grin. Of course, if you were really a local, you'd call me Albert, just like everyone else. She couldn't help but like his forthrightness. And you are welcome to call me Ava. I rarely get called anything else. What brings you around these parts, Ava? I can tell by your accent that you're not from Texas. Ah, don't get shy about it, it's a pretty accent. You've got a voice as smooth as silk. Anyhow, I'm not from Texas either, if it makes you feel any better. I suppose I wasn't expecting to have it commented upon, that's all. She was blushing, though she couldn't put her finger on why, exactly, his words might cause such a reaction. I'm here because I'm engaged to be married, as a matter of fact. No use beating around the bush, even if she wasn't at all certain that she would follow through with her engagement, and even if the strange man she was speaking to was strangely attractive. His eyebrows shot upwards, disappearing beneath his hat. Married? Why, I haven't heard a thing about it. The gossipers of Seymour have failed me. Who's the lucky fellow? Just as she opened her mouth to reply, she heard her name called from behind her. Ava. Oh, there you are. Blushing once more, she turned to see Kathy and Jacob coming toward her, as quickly as Jacob could manage. Poor man, he looked terribly worn out, she thought, his eyes were half closed, his face drawn into a deep frown. But as they approached, she saw Kathy's face begin to change as well, and the expression so markedly mirrored that of her older cousin that Ava wondered whether she might be feeling some strange and vivid pain as well. She stretched out a hand toward her, uncertain of what to do, but Ava's eyes were not on her, now. No, they were fixed beyond her, on the face of the man she had been speaking to. A deep blush spread over Kathy's rosy cheeks. Ava, she said, seeming to force her eyes to return to her new friend, we must get back to the ranch as quickly as we can. Jacob is not well. Of course, Ava said. I'm with you, I only just met Mr. Macklin, here. Do you know him? Good morning, Miss Kathy, said Albert Macklin, half smiling. The blush on Kathy's pretty face only deepened. Good morning, she said. Ava, we will be waiting at the cart. She helped her cousin to turn about, heading back the way they had come. Jacob did not say a word. Ava turned back to Albert, her eyes wide, feeling that she ought to apologize for their behavior, but suspecting at the same time that there was something more at play here. In the week that she had known Jacob Rogers, she had not seen anything that would lead her to suspect that he was capable of that sort of rudeness. Albert Macklin saw the look in her eyes and chuckled, spreading his hands. Yes, they know me, all right, he said. I was once as close as family, would have been family, too, but for someone changin' their mind. Oh, I don't blame Miss Kathy for it. She's a pretty girl, and she deserves to marry the man of her dreams, whoever he turns out to be. But his smile had a wry twist to it that suggested he was more bitter than he let on. She couldn't help but wonder what had led to it, what had happened in the past between Albert Macklin and the little family at Bar 1. I reckon you'd better get on and help Jake get back to the ranch. Poor fellow looks closer and closer to death's door every time I see him. The word struck her oddly, it seemed rude to address Jacob Rogers' illness so casually. But he was, after all, very obviously ill. And if Albert did indeed know them so closely, perhaps that could explain it. It did not make her feel any more settled, all the same. One last thing, Miss Ava, Albert said suddenly, touching her hand as she turned to go. I reckon it's Jonathan that you're here to marry, and not Jacob. Even Jake knows there's little point to taking a wife. Well, they're fine, upstanding men, both of them, but they both have their flaws. She frowned at him. Again, his words seemed almost too knowing, but she could not say whether he had a right to it or not. "I'm not afraid of flaws," she said. "I have plenty of my own, of course." He relaxed a little, just enough to chuckle. "That's hard to credit, from where I stand, Miss Ava," he said. "You look just about perfect to me. But Jonathan Rogers is different, he's a different breed. He may smile and be friendly, but you just keep a sharp eye out. You're a smart girl, you'll see that there's something underneath it." "What do you mean?" But he only shook his head, refusing to elucidate. He waved a hand at her, motioning her onward, back through town to meet Kathy and Jacob at the cart and return to Bar 1. She left Albert Macklin behind there in town, but his words traveled with her, wrapped around her shoulders as tightly as any cloak against the autumn breeze. Chapter 5. It didn't take long for Ava to decide that she ought to try her best to help solve whatever dilemma lay between the Rogers family and Albert Macklin. It only made sense, after all. Seymour was too small a town to allow bad blood to seep in. If she was to have any future here, she would have done her best to help in any case. And Albert had clearly been there for some time, 8 weeks or 8 years, he had said, but she suspected that it was the latter. He knew the town too well. Besides, 8 weeks was not long enough to develop the sort of complicated relations that evidently were in effect between him and Kathy Rogers. He wasn't shy about speaking up. Perhaps he would be her key to finding out what had happened to Nathan Barrow. Despite her uncertainty about what the future held for her engagement to Jonathan Rogers, Albert's words about the owner of Bar 1 were never far from her mind when Jonathan was about. She found herself watching him carefully from across the table at breakfast and supper. In the afternoons, when she went for her walk, she would cross in front of the barn and crane her neck to see whether he might be spotted inside the wide-open double doors. He certainly did not seem like the mysterious type, but then, she reminded herself, he had seemed quite enthusiastic to meet and marry her, and it was only because of his quiet conversation with his brother that she knew he had been reluctant in the extreme. He must have been having second thoughts about their engagement from the moment he agreed to it. Even now, weeks after the discovery, it never failed to make her feel a sharp spike of hurt, right through her heart, as though she had been rejected outright. Well, she would simply have to deal with that when it became necessary. In the meantime, she watched Jonathan, watched him interact with the ranch hands he had hired, watched him speak to his brother fondly and respectfully despite Jacob's illness and weakness, watched him tease his younger cousin. With Ava herself, he was friendly and warm, though less disposed to tease. She supposed that it was her own doing. She had treated him with a certain aloofness since her arrival, and he appeared to be doing his best to respond in kind, as that was evidently what she wanted. Was it what she wanted? She watched him joke and laugh with Kathy, and she wanted some of that affectionate warmth for herself. He was much more handsome when he smiled, after all. When he caught her looking his way, he would always give her a swift wink, a twinkle in his leaf-green eyes. No, she had to admit to herself, her feelings for Jonathan Rogers had not grown any less complicated in the few weeks she had been living at Bar 1. If anything, they were more complicated than ever, and that was despite Albert Macklin's warning. 2 weeks went by, then 3, and suddenly it was the first week of November, and the nights were colder than ever. The days, though, continued with their glorious sun. It was on one such day that Jonathan told Ava that it was high time she went into town again. "After all," he said, "I reckon there's been a letter waiting for you from your brother for at least a few days now. And I'd like to take you to the tea room. Mrs. Hodgett makes a wonderful cake." "Better than mine?" Kathy demanded, a hand on her hip. She had made cake just a few days before. "Of course not," said her cousin smoothly, grinning widely. "But there's no such thing as too much cake, Kathy. Say, maybe you and Mrs. Hodgett ought to have a competition. And I suppose you and Jacob would be the judges, is that right?" "Well, it only seems fair. It was my idea, after all." Kathy laughed and shook her head at him, and he returned his attention to Ava. By now, she had gathered her thoughts and was composed again. At first, his suggestion had thrown her off guard. Go into town, with only Jonathan himself? It would be easier if Kathy wanted to accompany them, but the young woman was already busying herself with picking up the breakfast things, and Ava knew that she had no interest in doing so. She'd said it herself, the bar one was pleasant enough for her, and she had no reason to go into town all that often. Ava couldn't help but wonder if there was some other reason behind the girl's reluctance to do so, but it wasn't the sort of thing she could ask casually. Perhaps it would come up in conversation, when it was just the two of them. "All right," she said steadily. "I'll go with you into town, Jonathan." His vivid green eyes glowed with pleasure, and she felt a jab of guilt. Here she was, so reluctant to spend time with him, even though they were engaged to be married, and he was doing his best to get to know her, despite her aloofness. Yes, he had evidently had second thoughts himself, but was that really a good reason to keep herself away from them? Not for the first time, she reminded herself that there was still a possibility that she would decide to marry him after all, and if that were the case, she would want to know him well, as a friend, not just the man who owned the house where she slept. That, of course, entailed finding out exactly what Albert Macklin had been hinting at. She set her mind to puzzling out how she might meet with Albert for a talk, even briefly, without letting Jonathan know. He gave her the opportunity with unwitting generosity. The drive into town was quite peaceful and pleasant, despite her misgivings. Jonathan spoke easily about the land around them and how much he loved it, talking now and then of his childhood and his parents. They had both died years before, his mother of the same heart complaint that even now plagued his elder brother, his father falling to a raging fever in the wake of his beloved wife's death. "I reckon he just didn't have the will to keep fighting, after she was gone," Jonathan said slowly, thoughtfully. "I thought maybe he'd keep on because of the ranch. He'd always seemed to love the land more than just about anything. But in the end, I guess it wasn't enough." He glanced at her swiftly and seemed to make a deliberate decision to change the subject. "Say, what about inviting your brother and sister-in-law to come out for the wedding?" She raised her eyebrows at him. "All the way to Texas?" "Sure. Trains run through here same as anywhere else. More than once a year, too." He was teasing her now, and she was surprised to find how much she liked it. "I don't know," she said. "It's an awfully long trip just for a wedding." "Well, they can stay as long as they like. We won't make them eat their cake on the train back." "You certainly do think about cake a great deal, don't you, Mr. Rogers?" He was just as surprised to hear her teasing him back as she was herself, but beyond a swift glance he did not show it. Instead, he laughed. "Can you blame me?" he said. "Now, what do you say to me leaving you off at the post office to write your letter to your brother while I tend to my errands? I'll come fetch you inside of an hour and we'll give Mrs. Hodgett's cake a try." Even more to her surprise, she found that she could not resist the urge to continue teasing. She put a hand on her hip and arched an eyebrow at him. "And what would you say, Jonathan Rogers, if I told you that I wasn't sure whether I liked cake at all?" "Well, Miss Evans," he said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, "I don't know exactly, but, well, I reckon I'd say that we'd better have a discussion about our engagement before we go any further." His voice was deadpan, serious, and it made her laugh even more than his usual teasing. He turned his twinkle on her, and they rolled into town like that, both chuckling. She covered her mouth suddenly, spotting Albert Macklin standing on a street corner. He watched her go by without waving. "Here you are," Jonathan said, pulling the horse to a stop before the post office. "I'll fetch you in an hour." "Oh, there's no need for that, I can walk to meet you." "Where should I be?" "Well, if you're sure, Mrs. Hodgett's is about 2 blocks away, down there and to the right." He directed her with a pointing finger. "You're sure you don't mind the walk?" "I'll look forward to it," she assured him as she stepped down from the cart. He still looked a bit dubious, but he gave her a nod and urged the horse onward. She hesitated on the threshold of the post office until he turned the corner out of sight, and then turned and hurried back the way they had come. Albert was no longer on the street corner. As she drew closer to it, he stepped out from the doorway leading to a little shop. The sign above it denoted it a haberdasher's establishment. "Miss Ava." "Oh, Albert. I was hoping I'd get a chance to speak with you." He was frowning, in marked contrast to the friendliness of their previous conversation. He glanced side to side for a moment, and then gestured her to follow him inside the shop. "No customers at the moment," he said. "Are you the haberdasher?" "No, that's John McCrae." I take measurements and reassure ladies and gentlemen that they look fine, just fine. He held up a half-finished hat, proffering it to her. Care to try it out yourself? His mood was odd, his voice was teasing, but his face still wore its frown, making him appear more than ever like an infant, albeit a petulant one. Hesitantly, she took the hat and set it atop her head. He grinned suddenly. Well, miss, he said, you look fine, just fine. She took the hat off hastily and handed it back to him. Albert, I've been thinking about what you said. I'm glad to hear it. The way you and Jonathan Rogers were carrying on, would never have known. Oh, but, well, you haven't said anything very specific. I warned you about him, didn't I? You can't tell me that you don't see anything strange about him when you're with him. She racked her brains, trying to think of what he might be referring to. I suppose he can be rather aloof, but really, it's because of me, I think. I certainly treat him that way, and I believe he's trying to behave as he thinks I want him to. That's hardly the mark of an honest man, is it? I don't know that he's said anything dishonest. No? He's been truthful and straightforward with you about everything, has he? She bit her lip. No, she couldn't say as much, could she? After all, he had kept his reluctance to marry from her. Even now, when they seemed to be getting along, he had not confessed that he was late to collect her from the train because he wasn't sure whether he wanted to collect her at all. What his reasons were for this reluctance, she hadn't the faintest idea. Yes, she had to admit it, though, in the moment, she was rather loath to do so, that Jonathan Rogers was hardly as honest as she wanted to believe. If you could only tell me a bit more about the problem, she said slowly, I'm sure that I could help to solve it. It's clear that there is bad blood between you and the Rogers. Bad blood, he repeated bitterly. I guess you could call it that. Plenty of blood spilled, anyhow, even if none of it was mine. Albert, what are you saying? He turned to her swiftly. The bitterness was gone, and so was his obvious anger, both to be replaced with an earnestness that took her aback with its strength. It was almost frightening to see the conviction in his face, hear it in his voice. He took her hands in his, holding them tightly. She wondered if he could feel the frantic beating of her heart through her fingertips. I fear for you, Ava, he said. Jonathan Rogers is a dangerous man. Oh, not all the time, maybe, not to everyone. But he has that in him, that darkness, and you never know when it will rear its ugly head. I'd hate to see anything happen to you, Ava. Just as suddenly as he had taken hold of her, he let her go and turned away again. She stood still for a moment, trembling slightly in the wake of his emotion, and clutched her hands together. Albert. It's awful sweet of you to want to help, he said, and his voice was changed again, lighter now, and warm. But I reckon it's a little too late for that. If Jonathan and Jake hadn't already decided against me before I had a chance, but, well, like I said. Too late. She took a deep breath. Albert, please, tell me what you mean by it all. It's all down to Kathy, he said, and he lifted his head to the ceiling and sighed, his shoulders rising and falling, before he turned back to her. His eyes were full of tears, she was startled to see. It isn't her fault, of course, she's young now, and she was even younger then, 6 years ago. She didn't know what she wanted. She tried to please her cousins, keep in their good graces. I reckon that's about the worst you could say of her. She bit her lip, biting back the questions that flooded to her tongue, unwilling to interrupt if he was able to explain. It was the Rogers boys who made the decision, in the end. I came to them with my suit, and Jonathan sent me half flying into the yard. I remember laying there and looking up, seeing him laugh and brush off his hands like he'd thrown out the rubbish. He shook his head, grinding his teeth a little. I admit it hurt my pride more than anything. Oh, I was sweet on Kathy, but I won't pretend it was any great romance, a love story for the ages. I would have been a good husband to her, but they decided that I was too poor. I have no family to my name, and I've been in Seymour less than a decade. They held it against me that I had come here to seek my fortune in gold, and I reckon they held it against me even more that I failed. If I was a wealthy prospector instead of a simple, hard-working man in a haberdasher's shop, maybe they would have felt differently about it. He shook his head again. But that's all in the past now, Ava. They found someone they thought would suit Kathy better, at least, at first. A rueful grin, with no mirth in it. That changed, too. I won't tell you that the Rogers are rotten, Ava, for there's good things in them, the same as in all God's creatures. But I hate to think of you being a part of that family and letting them change who you are. He put a hand to her cheek, warm and tender, and loomed close over her. His eyes sought hers, and she realized suddenly that there was little color in them, only a plain dark brown. There was a flatness to them that made her want to step back. She stepped back, and he let his hand drop to his side, silently. Another wry smile twisted his lips. I'm sorry, Ava, he said. I can't tell you any more than that. Maybe Jonathan himself can, maybe you should ask him, someday, what happened that night, to the poor fellow on the road. Ask him, Ava, ask him before you make yourself his wife. She could not think of what to say in reply that did not sound like either a denial or a promise. And so, wordlessly, she turned from him and left the shop, and his words followed her like ravens. Chapter 6. Was it possible? Was it possible that the family she had now spent a month with, day in and day out, sharing their roof and their supper table, could really be as pride-ridden and disdainful as Albert Macklin made them out to be? They weren't villains, of this, she was nearly certain. Jacob was too ill to do anything wicked, and Kathy was too sweet. Of the three of them, if any fault needed to be placed, it would have to be laid at Jonathan's door. And even this, Ava was reluctant to believe. She could not determine for certain how she felt about him, but her own feelings did not mean that he was a bad man. The more that she thought about Albert's words, however, the more she wondered what the secrets of the past truly held. Jonathan had spoken of his reluctance to marry her, but was it truly his reluctance to be engaged to her, Ava herself? Or might there be something else underlying it, some hidden guilt? Or she told herself sternly, perhaps she was making all of this far too complicated. Well, if so, it would at least match her emotions. With the harvest drawing near, Jonathan and Jacob spent more and more time out of doors, even though the days were growing ever shorter. They were gone when Ava arose before sunrise, and it often wasn't until after dark that they returned. She couldn't help but wonder how a man as clearly ill as Jacob Rogers could manage to sustain himself for such long, arduous days. But one morning, not long after breakfast, she spotted him returning to the house and making his way silently up the stairs toward his bedroom, head down, feet dragging. Her heart went out to him, and to his brother and his cousin, who must feel far more strongly than she herself did. Jacob Rogers was a man with limited years ahead of him. How terrible it must be to feel the weight of your destiny crushing in on you at every moment. But even as she thought it, he glanced to the side and spotted her, and his usual warm smile spread over his face. Hello there, Miss Ava. How are you on this beautiful morning? Her words were nearly caught in her throat. Fine, thank you, Jacob, she managed. He tilted his head slightly, his smile fading, and she amended it swiftly. Jake. His smile was stronger now. They must have really loved their younger sister Mary, she thought, though they rarely spoke of her. They rarely spoke of anything that had caused them trouble and pain in the past, and when they did, it was with frank acknowledgement and an unspoken but clear desire to move on. The same went for Jacob's illness, though she had heard them all, at one time or another, except the fact that he was not long for this world. They seemed far more focused on enjoying the time that they had together, showing their affection and trust with every teasing word, every caring action. Her own emotions surprised and overwhelmed her, and she turned her head away, blinking back tears as Jacob went on his slow and laborious way up the stairs. She had, she realized, become quite attached to the Rogers family in the brief time that she had been there on Bar 1. But the mystery that lurked underneath it all remained at the back of her mind through every moment of the sunny days that passed in their orderly fashion. It wasn't until sometime after her last interview with Albert that she was able to speak with Kathy about the subject. They'd had plenty of time to talk, they spent most of their days together, and Ava found that the younger woman was easily the most pleasant and genial companion she'd ever had. Indeed, she thought of her as her closest friend. It was because of this, perhaps, that she was reluctant to broach the subject, fearful of causing Kathy any additional pain. In a way, it was Kathy herself who brought it up. They were speaking of the oncoming winter when she said, suddenly, "I do hope that you and Johnny set a day for your wedding soon. It ought to be before Christmas, don't you think?" "Do you think so?" Ava, taken aback, wasn't sure how to answer. She proceeded cautiously. "Of course, it's really up to Jonathan." "Oh, he wouldn't do a thing without making sure of your opinion," said his cousin confidently. "He only wants to make you happy. That's what Jonathan is like, he wants to make everyone happy, and he rarely thinks about his own happiness." She smiled widely. "That's why we had to convince him to apply for a mail-order bride. But we're so glad that he listened at last." Despite her misgivings, Ava couldn't help but smile back. "Then I'm glad," she said, and was rather surprised to find that she meant it. "But why before Christmas? Surely there's no hurry." "No, not really. It's just that," Kathy sighed. "Poor Jacob looks more ill with every passing day. He's so weak some days that I really feel he shouldn't be getting out of bed, and yet he will do it. He says it's what keeps him going. Maybe he's right. It's his heart, you know, it's always been weak. I remember my mother telling my father in hushed tones that they didn't expect him to live past 20. And look at him now, still going strong, well, still going, anyhow." Another sigh. "I can't imagine life without him, but Jonathan worries, I know, that he won't make it through another winter. It would make Jacob so happy to see his younger brother married and settled." The emotion in her voice was real and raw, and yet her words were matter of fact, plainly stated. Ava put a hand on her shoulder, swiftly, and managed another reassuring smile. "I'm sure that Jonathan will make the right decision," she said. "We all want Jacob to be happy." "Thank you, Ava. I'm glad that you feel that way, too." "I suppose I'm surprised, a little," Ava went on, feeling her way carefully, "that you haven't married yourself and settled down. It's obvious that your cousins adore you and think the world of you. Surely it would make Jacob even happier to know that you were cared for by a good husband, someone you loved dearly. That's all that any of us want for our loved ones, isn't it?" She kept her gaze on her tea, watching the steam curl up from it in ethereal tendrils, waiting for Kathy to speak. But the younger woman said nothing, and finally Ava dared to look up. Kathy, too, was looking downward, her gaze focused on her hands, which were clutched tightly together on the table in front of her. "I suppose," she managed at last. "But when the one you love cannot marry you." There was such plaintive hurt in her voice that Ava knew at once that she was thinking of someone. Could it be that she had not been so indifferent to Albert as he had supposed? Perhaps, if he had been unaware of her true feelings, but it called for a measure of humility that she had difficulty crediting Albert Macklin with, despite her instinctive liking for him. Cautiously, she said, "I know that it is very hard to consider marrying someone you do not love, especially if you are in love with another." Now Kathy looked up, her eyes darkened with her pain. "Do you?" she said vaguely. "I never knew it, myself. I always assumed that marrying would be straightforward, a simple case of making the best decision. I was never a romantic, I suppose. I was raised so poor, romance was a luxury. And then after Ma and Pa passed away, I came here and," she bit her lip, shaking her head abruptly. "Everything was so different, here in Seymour. There were so many men, all of them eager to pay attention to me, to make a friend of me. I loved it at first, until I realized, gradually, that it was really Jacob and Jonathan that they wanted to befriend. They had the money, you see. I was a poor relation, but a doorway to the Rogers fortune, all the same." She sighed. "Is that cynical of me, Ava?" Ava echoed her sigh. "I suppose some might say so," she said. "But if it's true, but it can't have been true of everyone, Kathy, surely. You're a beautiful girl, and so sweet and pleasant, surely at least some of those many men were truly interested in you. Perhaps they might have been, if any of them had troubled to get to know me, but none of them did." She paused. "Except one." "Tell me," Ava requested gently. "If you would like, that is." "I would like, oh, I haven't spoken of him for so long," and it causes me such guilt. Every time I do, I can see on Johnny's face that it hurts him to think of it, and I end up feeling more guilty still. I love my cousins, Ava, they have been as good as fathers and brothers to me. I can't stand to cause them any pain. That's because you're a good woman, Ava assured her. Because you're kind and gentle and worthy. They feel the same about you, I'm sure of it. Yes, some might say to a fault. There was a note of bitterness in her tone that Ava couldn't help but wonder at. But Kathy did not elucidate, and Ava left it for a moment before continuing. Tell me about him, she said again. Oh. Kathy heaved a long, heartfelt sigh. He was so very handsome, the way he smiled when we met, I just knew that he felt something as special as I did. His hands were so warm, it was autumn when I first met him, and he happened to be passing by on the street. A cold wind had come up and he offered me his coat. Ava nodded, thinking of how similar the story sounded to her own first meeting with Albert. He was new to Seymour, and had come seeking his fortune, like so many others. But there was something different about him. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was, it was the way he looked at me. Her eyes found Ava's, pleading with her to understand. I felt as though I'd been truly seen for the first time in my life. Ava nodded. She put a hand over the girl's, still clutched tightly together on the table, and felt her slowly relax. Romantic by nature or not, she said, it found you. But what happened, Kathy? Whatever the cause of the bad blood between your cousins and Albert, surely if you tell them how you feel, they'll understand. Kathy sat back in her chair, staring at her. Albert, she said. Albert Macklin? She did not laugh, but Ava had the uncomfortable feeling that it was largely because she was too offended to find any humor in the situation. Yes, she said, wondering how to find her way out of the hole she had blundered into, one she had dug with her own hands, it seemed. I'm sorry, I thought you must be speaking of Albert. I can see now that I was wrong, but... What on earth made you think, no, I think I know. She shook her head. No need to explain that to me. Albert Macklin. He would try to say something to make you think, no, Ava, I am not in love with Albert Macklin. I am in love with someone else. Her eyes flooded with tears, though she had kept them at bay all this while. I can't imagine marrying any other man but him, but it is not to be, for he's gone. Gone, and he's never coming back. Ava's own eyes pricked with tears in sympathy, but she took a deep breath and steeled herself. Albert's telling of the tale was evidently false, at least to some degree, but of course, there were two sides to every story, she reminded herself. And this story belonged to Kathy Rogers. What was his name? She asked gently. This man you loved so much. Kathy's pink cheeks darkened with a blush, but she met Ava's eyes unflinchingly. His name was Nathan, she said. Nathan Barrow. Chapter 7. On a blustery day in mid-November, Ava Evans braved the storm clouds that were gathering in the far west and made her way into Seymour on foot. It wasn't her first choice, of course, traveling in the cart was much to be preferred. But traveling in the cart meant asking someone to take her in, and regardless of whether it was Kathy or Jonathan, she did not feel capable of explaining her reasons for needing to visit the town yet again. It certainly had not been long enough that she should expect another letter from her brother, and she had no other needs that were not easily met at the ranch. She was beginning to sympathize with Kathy. It would be so very easy simply never to leave Bar 1 at all, for what did she need that the ranch did not provide? Only one thing, a chance at the truth. She had known before she heard Nathan's name from Kathy's lips that she would need to speak with Albert again. He had been so very careful in what he said, in how he spoke, in the hints he gave her and the secrets he implied, but she had liked him, for all that, and hoped that even now he might prove an ally, if she could just get to him. And if she could only get him to speak frankly. It was obviously contrary to his nature, but people had done things contrary to their nature for hundreds of years. She was doing one herself, right now. It had been difficult not to let her emotions burst from her, upon hearing the name of Kathy's love. Even now, the thought of it squeezed at her heart. But just as Kathy's view of her relationship with Albert was markedly different from Albert's view of the same, Ava knew that she could not simply trust everything that the younger woman told her on the subject. Hadn't she herself seen it firsthand, especially when it came to Nathan? When he had said goodbye to her, she had heard only the promise to come back, the promise to love her forever. When her brother Ben heard the same words, he heard a lie. And though her heart was beginning to close and harden, she knew that she had to find out the truth. Besides, she'd had little more chance to get any more information from Kathy. Speaking of her long-lost love, voicing his name, had taken all her strength from her. Kathy, like her cousins, worked very hard at maintaining a brave front, at focusing on the positive rather than the negative. But it was not easy, and at times even the best-built dam must break. The younger woman had taken to her bedroom for the rest of the day, and when Ava had tried to speak with her the next morning, a simple glance at her darkened eyes and sorrowful expression had been all the reply that was needed. Ava had grown quite attached to Kathy. The last thing she wanted to do was cause her any more pain. No, Albert Macklin would have to be her source of information, and she would simply have to hope and pray that he told her everything she wanted to know. The journey into town was not long, though it took far longer on foot than it did in the cart. But it was an easy walk. She left the ranch a good hour earlier than she usually ventured out for her walk, taking advantage of the fact that Kathy had once again closed herself in her room and that the Rogers men were doing their best to finish chores before the storm came in. For a long moment, perched on the top of a slight rise, Ava stood to catch her breath, looking out at the storm clouds moving her way. They seemed to move far more swiftly than any she'd ever seen in New York. They were enormous, thunderheads piled high. The breeze that cooled her face held a hint of rain. If all went well, she would be back in the ranch house before the storm hit. If not, she supposed, she would say that she got caught in it on her way back from her walk. That would be true, if not the entire truth. It was the first storm of fall, and her first storm in Texas. Far off in the distance, looking almost unnatural, she saw lightning flicker from cloud to ground. Taking a deep breath, she turned and continued her way, moving faster now. The skies overhead were growing dark as she reached Seymour, even though it was only just past 1 in the afternoon. She wended her way through the hard-packed dirt streets until she found the haberdasher's shop. This time, she noted the name of the owner painted above the door, John McCrae. But luck was with her. Mr. McCrae was yet again out, and there were no customers waiting for their craniums to be measured. Instead, there was only Albert Macklin, leaning on his elbows over the counter, engrossed in a novel. He glanced up as she came in the door, mouth open to speak, to tell her that the haberdasher was not in and she should return, perhaps? And then he abandoned whatever he had planned to say in favor of a grin. "Miss Ava. You're a sight for sore eyes. Dare I hope that you're here seeking my company?" He was around the counter and reaching for her hands before she had a chance to reply. "I am," she said, withdrawing her hands from his grasp after only the briefest moment. "But I'm afraid you won't like it when you find out my reason." "Well." He withdrew a step, regarding her seriously, and his smile slowly faded. "Maybe not." He leaned back against the counter and folded his arms. "I suppose you've talked to Jonathan, and he told you that he's innocent as a newborn babe. I reckon he told you also that I'm not to be trusted, something along the lines of playing with the hearts of honest girls and leaving them much the worse for wear. Don't look surprised, it's not as though he hasn't said things like that before." "I'm not surprised," she said, frowning slightly. "Or rather, I didn't hear him say it. I didn't talk to him, not yet. I spoke to Kathy." The fire went out of his eyes a little and his head drooped. He let his arms fall to his sides. "I see," he said. "Albert, I'm in terrible need of the truth. I wouldn't have come here otherwise. I know that your relations with the Rogers family are rather complicated." He snorted. "Guess that's one way to put it. But if you could set that aside for the moment and just tell me." This was harder than she had expected. It was difficult to get the words out with any clarity. She pressed her hands together in front of her, beseeching him. "Tell me about Nathan Barrow." For a long moment, he simply gazed at her. The light in his eyes was rekindling even as she watched, and she was aware of a growing feeling of being unsettled. In truth, she did not know Albert Macklin nearly as well as she had thought she did, and she hadn't the faintest idea what he would do next. "So, you know about Barrow," he said. "I know that Kathy was in love with him." He rubbed his chin. "That's all?" "Something happened. I don't know just what." "Something," he repeated, in a voice near a whisper. "Something happened, all right. I was in love with Kathy, you know. I told her as much, when I asked her whether I could court her. We'd have made a good match. She could do worse, here in Seymour. She was ready to consider it. Maybe I flatter myself, but I reckon she wasn't entirely indifferent to me either. She would have said yes, if her cousins hadn't turned me down flat and done their best to run me off like a dog with its tail between its legs." He shook his head abruptly, as though to shake the memory out entirely. "And before I had a chance to try again, to press my suit, this other fellow stepped in. This was 6 years ago, or so. He'd just arrived. A flirt and a fortune hunter, like any of the rest, except he was a little too late to find his fortune in gold here in Seymour. So, I reckon he set his sights on the next best thing. A fortune is still a fortune, no matter how you find it, gold or girl, it's all the same." Ava closed her eyes for a moment, turning her head away. She felt as though she had never hated anyone so much as she hated Albert Macklin at that moment, though she knew that it was not fair. It was his story he was telling, and this was how he saw it, whether it was the truth or not. For all that, she had to admit that there was a chance that it was true. Nathan had struck out for Archer County hoping to make his fortune. It was her own fault if she believed he would only settle for one way to go about it. In her mind, she heard her brother's voice, echoing and strange. "There comes a time when it is no longer dignified to be so caught up in a man who may not have loved you to begin with." She swallowed hard. It might not be true, what her brother had always believed, what Albert Macklin was telling her now. She might still be right to have held on to Nathan so firmly, to have believed him to be a good man. If this was the truth, it wasn't telling her anything for a certainty. What happened? She heard her own voice dimly, as though through a fog. "No matter what anyone says, I cared about Kathy," Albert said, and his voice was low and fierce. "And Mary, too. No one knows how I really felt. And I proved it, didn't I, when I went to Jonathan and told him my concerns. He said it was just to try and get on his good side, or to get rid of the competition, but I never said anything that wasn't true. Not about Nathan Barrow. Not about anyone. What I said was the truth and nothing more. But Jonathan, he didn't want to listen. Tossed me out on my ear, like he'd done before. Told me never to darken his door again. I left. I had a chip on my shoulder by then, I guess you could say. Never been so angry, but Jonathan must have listened to me, all the same, for the next day Nathan went to speak with him in the early afternoon and by nightfall, he was dead. The words came to her like a slap across the face, like a bucket of cold water dashed over her. And yet, after the first horrified intake of breath, she felt a numbness that must have been waiting there, waiting for its time. She had known, no, she had suspected, that this would be the end of her search for Nathan. 6 years had gone by, surely, she would have heard something if he were still alive. But now she knew for sure that he had left this world behind not long after he had left her, waiting at the window in her bedroom in her brother's house, lighting a candle and praying for her loved one to return. Rich or poor, she wouldn't have cared. She didn't want a fortune, she had only wanted him. And now he was dead, and she was engaged to the richest man in Archer County, and her heart was as hollow as a drum. She turned away from Albert, but not fast enough. He must have seen something in her face, for he reached out and took hold of her hand. His voice was kinder now. "You're upset," he said. "I'm sorry to have to tell you all of this, Ava, but it's for your own good. It's because I care about you, too. Jonathan may be rich enough to buy the silence of the sheriff, but he's guilty for all of that. If anyone is responsible for the death of Nathan Barrow, it's him." He waited a moment, staring at her, waiting for her to speak. But she could not. She couldn't think of what to say, or how to say it. She wasn't sure whether she would ever speak again. Did she believe it? Could she believe it? Could she prove otherwise, if she didn't? The friendly, rather weathered face of Jonathan Rogers was waiting for her when she closed her eyes, smiling at her. The face of the man who had killed the man she loved. How could it be? "It's rainin' hard," Albert said at last. "I'll take you back to the ranch." She shook her head, but he ignored her. In her numbness, she was scarcely aware that he had put an oilskin coat over her head, that he was leading her outside. It must have been a borrowed cart. She was certain he didn't have one of his own. But there they were, jouncing along the rutted, muddy road toward Bar 1, and the heavens above were no longer blue and serene and beautiful, but gray and dark and angry. The nighttime, it seemed, had come in the middle of the day. Chapter 8. All through the stormy night, Ava lay awake, hearing Albert's urgent voice, seeing his earnest, round face, eyes squinting in his eagerness. "I'll help you," he said again and again. "Come to me tomorrow, I'll help you to leave. We can go together. I'll help you, I won't let you be alone." And then the tone of his voice would change, and the look in his eye would become a gleam, and he would tell her, "If anyone is responsible for the death of Nathan Barrow, it's Jonathan Rogers." She awoke to a calm, peaceful, blue autumn morning, so placid that she wondered if she had imagined the storm the day before. But there was the fresh smell of rain in the air, and the dirt of the yard was clearly still drenched. She sat by the window for a moment and closed her eyes, listening to the chickens squawking in the run, the far-off barking of an excited dog, the cows lowing in the meadow. Beneath her, the friendly sound of baking and cooking, pots clanking and a maid whistling, emanated from the kitchen. The breeze caught the strong scent of baking apples and carried it to her like an offering. Down below, Kathy was going about her business with her brave and cheerful smile. Jacob was resting, no doubt, thinking only of the day ahead without any thought for the future that might end at any time. And somewhere out there, Jonathan. She opened her eyes at the same instant that the younger Rogers brother stepped out of the barn. He lifted his head to the sun, and even from this distance she could see him smiling. His eyes caught sight of her and the smile widened, as though she were the sun herself. She lifted a hand to wave to him before she could stop herself. He pressed a hand to his lips and flung it wide, blowing her a kiss teasingly, and she heard him laugh. The sound made her heart clench. He had a gift for making her smile. She knew then that she had to leave. She could not bear to find out that Albert's words were true, that Jonathan Rogers was responsible for the death of Nathan Barrow. She could not live with it if it were so. She cared too much for both, and it broke her heart to think that they should ever have been at odds. What, then, was there for her to do? Nothing other than pack her valise with everything she needed that she could carry and wait for the afternoon to come that she might go for her usual walk, and find her way back to Albert, who had promised to help her. Her absence downstairs that morning seemed to go unnoticed. At breakfast time, she heard laughter and chatting drift upwards through windows thrown open to the warmer air. She longed to go down and be among the Rogers, as though nothing was wrong, but she knew herself and knew that she could not keep her emotions from her face. No, she had to hide herself away until it was time to leave. Then, at last, the quiet that signified that everyone had gone about their business for the day descended. She waited still, agonizing over every passing moment, until it was just past noon. The maids and the housekeeper would be taking their dinner in the kitchen. Kathy would be with them, no doubt, as she always was, for she liked the company. Ava took her valise in hand and made her way stealthily down the stairs. Sure enough, she could hear Kathy's silvery laugh from the hallway. She knew that she would regret forever not saying her farewells, but there was nothing to be done about it. It was simply another regret. She would add it to the others and carry it with her in her pocket. The house was left behind, and she was almost to the pond before she heard the voice behind her. "Ava. Wait." Ava's heart clenched, nearly stopping. Reluctantly, she turned, holding her bag in front of her as though she needed its protection from the pink-cheeked young woman who was rushing toward her. Kathy came to a halt scarcely 2 feet from her, and they stood for a moment on the banks of the pond. Today the breeze had come up, Ava noted distantly, and ruffled the surface into ripples that carried the fallen leaves from one side to the other like ships across the ocean. Kathy took a deep breath, putting a hand to her chest. You move awful fast for just going on a walk. Ava dropped her gaze. Come to think of it, it's a little funny, you taking your suitcase along with you for a walk, too. Kathy gave her a narrow-eyed look that was somewhere between mockery and seriousness. Good thing I thought to look in your room and realized it was missing, or I might not have come after you. No, the fact that you didn't come down for breakfast or dinner and that you snuck out of the house when you thought I was busy didn't alert me at all. Kathy. Ava. Kathy smiled at her, and took the valise from her, plopping it onto the damp ground at their feet. We're friends, aren't we? Ava bit her lip. Yes. Then tell me what's wrong. I know that something's gone awful awry, tell me, and we'll fix it, all of us together. You're part of the Rogers clan now, Ava, and you can't simply slip away. Despite her best intentions, Ava felt tears pricking at her eyes. You never loved Albert, did you? Kathy raised her eyebrows. Do you have to ask? I just want to be sure. No, I never loved Albert. I was flattered by Albert, I guess. She looked down at her hands, twining her fingers together self-consciously. But that was before I knew the truth about him. What truth? Like just about every other fellow here in Seymour, Kathy said, he's a fortune hunter. When I came here, after Ma and Pa died, it wasn't too long after poor Mary passed. The Rogers, well, we're not a strong family, I guess you'd say. We tend to have weak hearts. Mary was no exception. It was awful for Jacob and Johnny to lose her. They took me in right away, maybe faster than they might have if they weren't missing their sister so much. I liked Seymour and got along well with just about everyone. But Albert put himself forward, as something special. Was it a smile or a wince that narrowed her eyes and twisted her face? Ava couldn't be certain, but she had her suspicions. Like I said, I was flattered at first. A poor girl like me, I wasn't used to getting that much attention. But when Jacob told me that he'd been engaged to Mary before she died. Ava drew a deep breath, understanding washing over her. It made sense now, down to Albert's strange trick of calling Jacob by his family nickname. Well, it didn't seem right. It had only been a few months, and here he was confessing his undying love for me. I knew he'd done the same for her. It wasn't either of us that he loved, it was Johnny's fortune. I told him I didn't want to see him anymore, but he didn't think I was serious. He kept comin' and finally Johnny told him he'd better not come around again, or he'd regret it. I believe Johnny meant it, too, he's been awful protective of me. I can understand why, Ava said. He cares for you so, and after losing his younger sister. Yes. Kathy nodded eagerly, glad that Ava understood. And poor Jacob, well, Johnny was protective, like I said. And when I met Nathan, she reached out and took Ava's hand, her eyes beseeching her. It hurts you to hear me say his name, doesn't it? That's the secret. Tell me, Ava. Tell me everything. And steeling herself, doing her best to keep her tears at bay, Ava did. She told her of how she had fallen head over heels for Nathan Barrow, 7 years before, how his friendship had led to the happiest days of her life, how he had made her feel that the tragedies that had marked her younger years were over, and how he had said his goodbyes and gone west to seek his fortune, against her wishes and against the advice of her brother, Ben. And finally, she told her of how she'd agreed to marry Jonathan because of where he lived, Archer County, the last place Nathan had been headed 6 years before. Ben didn't think that Nathan's love would survive being away from me for so long, she said at last, forcing her eyes to meet Kathy's once more. And I suppose he was right. Kathy's eyes, too, were full of tears. Without a word, she threw her arms around Ava and hugged her tightly. The two women clung together, weeping, while the quiet pond lapped at the shores near their feet. At last, Kathy stood up straight, throwing her shoulders back and regaining some composure. I believe, she said, that he did love you. And I believe that he loved me, too. Love is complicated, Ava, but that doesn't mean it isn't real for all that. Ava managed a smile through her tears. You're right, she said. And I believe it too, now that I know you. Of course, he must have loved you, Kathy, and I have to believe he felt the same way to me. It's only that time changes a heart, sometimes, not that he was lying to either of us, but maybe he was lying a little to himself. She wiped her eyes with her fingertips. If you two had been married, I would have been happy to arrive here and find that he'd made someone like you his wife. But, what happened? Kathy shook her head and sighed. Albert told Johnny that Nathan was everything that Albert was himself. Johnny didn't believe him. He learned long ago not to believe a word Albert says, but he did ask Nathan about his past. Something came up, maybe it was you. They had an argument. I heard every word of it, and it just about broke my heart, but it wasn't Johnny's fault. Ava pressed her lips together. Nathan always had a temper, she said. He argued with my brother a time or two, too. He left in a huff, I guess. It was getting dark, and he didn't know the way so well. Somehow, he got turned off on a side road, and his horse stumbled and threw him. She closed her eyes, and Ava pressed her hand. It's all right. You don't have to say it. Slowly, Kathy regained her composure once more. Some folks blamed Johnny for chasing him off, she said. But that wasn't the way of it. Sometimes, Ava, bad things just happen. Ava nodded, her eyes drifting out to the pond. It was true, bad things simply happened at times, and it was no one's fault. Nor was it a curse, or a withholding of a blessing. Nor, at the same time, did it need to be the only mark that was left on a person's soul. She'd had her share of tragedy. She couldn't deny it. But so had the Rogers, and they faced more, even now. She thought of Jacob climbing the stairs to his bedroom. Someday, it would be for the last time. And even then, she knew with every bit of her, he would turn and smile at anyone who was there to see. She could choose to be like that. She reckoned that the Rogers would help her. Still holding her hand, Kathy drew in a quick breath, and Ava turned to see what had captured her attention. It was a man, a tall, slim man, dressed in dirty dungarees and a flannel shirt opened at the neck, his sleeves rolled up above his elbows. He had his hands in his pockets, and, she noted, a quietly sheepish expression on his face. How strange it was to think that she had ever considered that face anything other than handsome. She could admit it now, though she couldn't before. Jonathan Rogers was the most attractive man she'd ever laid eyes on. Kathy squeezed her hand and smiled. You'll talk to him, she said, with absolute certainty. He'll help you. That's what Johnny does, he helps everyone fix things. Remember, Ava, all he wants is for you to be happy. Then she was gone, trudging back toward the ranch house, and Jonathan Rogers was standing there in front of her. She kept her eyes on the ruffled water for a moment, trying to get her breath back. She'd lost it rather abruptly upon realizing he was standing there. But she lost it again when she turned to face him at last and saw the kindness, warmth, and undeniable love in his vibrant green eyes. You heard it all? She asked softly. Pretty much most of it, I guess. Then you know I was planning to leave. He lifted his shoulders in a movement that was not exactly a shrug, more of an acknowledgement that he was unsure of what to say. Are you planning to leave now? Should I? Ava Evans, he said, I reckon we'd both better stick to declarative sentences from now on or we'll never get anywhere. She smiled, covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to laugh. He was grinning, though. What shall we do? She asked at last. You know that I was in love with another man. And that he was untrue to you, even if he did love you. Her hand dropped. I have to believe he did. Of course he did, Jonathan said. Who wouldn't? Her pulse increased and it was difficult to speak, but she managed it at last. You're not to blame for what happened to him. I know it, he sighed. But I carry the guilt all the same. Why do you think I was so reluctant to collect you at the train station? I felt I would never deserve the love of a good woman. He bowed his bare head, and she reached up tentatively to place her hand on it, running her fingers softly through his dark hair. Her heart quickened and her throat tightened. At their side, the pond stilled, the breeze had died down, and the world around them felt as though it was holding its breath. And yet, she said, feeling suddenly strong and sure, you've got it. You've got the love of a good woman. He looked up, and the expression in his eyes nearly made her heart stop, then start again, running smooth and fast. Are you sure you could love me, Ava? Jonathan asked quietly. After all, I'm a flawed man. Ava smiled up at him, lacing her fingers through his. Are you? She said. From where I'm standing, you look pretty perfect to me. He bent to kiss her for the first time. Behind them, across the rolling fields of Bar 1, the breeze came up, carrying a hint of rain and the promise of the future. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susanna Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susanna Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susanna Calloway Western romance.